Please, we already surrendered. The pirate captain laughed and cut the transmission. 12 hours later, he would be the one begging for help. Out in the outer rim, where shipping lanes stretched across millions of miles of empty darkness, most freighter crews learned the same lesson sooner or later. Space was too big for anyone to come save you. If trouble showed up, you dealt with it yourself. The TSV Resolute drifted through that darkness like a tired old workhorse. Her hull was scratched, her paint was faded, and from a distance she looked exactly like what she claimed to be. A civilian cargo ship hauling industrial equipment between remote mining colonies. Nothing flashy, nothing valuable, nothing worth remembering. Captain Mason Walker preferred it that way. He sat in the command chair with a mug of coffee that had gone cold nearly an hour ago. At 42, Mason had spent more of his life in space than on Earth. He had the face of a man who slept too little and worried too much. Most days he worried about fuel costs, shipping delays, and maintenance reports. Today felt different. Captain, Logan Reed called from the engineering console. You need to see this. Mason looked up. Logan rarely sounded concerned. The engineer was the kind of guy who treated reactor warnings like minor inconveniences. What do you got? Logan turned his monitor. A red contact marker blinked on the screen. Then another. Then 3 more. The bridge suddenly felt smaller. Rachel Bennett, the ship's security officer, leaned forward in her seat. That's not normal traffic. Mason already knew it wasn't. The formation was wrong. Commercial vessels didn't approach from multiple vectors. These ships were moving with purpose. Identification? Mason asked. Logan shook his head. Transponders are dark. Nobody spoke for a moment. They all understood what that meant. Rachel broke the silence first. Pirates. Mason slowly set his coffee down. Around the bridge, several younger crew members exchanged nervous looks. One of them, a cargo specialist barely out of his 20s named Tyler Brooks, swallowed hard. Are we in trouble? He asked. Mason looked at the kid and saw something that reminded him of his own son back home in Colorado. Not fear exactly. Uncertainty. The kind that comes when somebody realizes adults might not have all the answers. Mason forced a calm smile. We're not in trouble yet. The proximity alarm sounded. One sharp tone, then another. The unidentified ships were closing fast. Rachel checked tactical data. They're locking on. Tyler's face turned pale. Can we outrun them? Logan let out a short laugh. In this ship? Not a chance. A few people chuckled nervously. The tension eased for half a second before the bridge speakers crackled to life. A rough, synthetic voice filled the room. Human vessel. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding. Nobody moved. Mason stared through the main viewport at the stars ahead. Somewhere beyond them was home. Somewhere beyond them was everything ordinary people fought so hard to protect. The voice returned. Failure to comply will result in consequences. Rachel looked toward Mason. Orders, Captain? Every eye on the bridge turned toward him. Mason felt the weight of it immediately. Not fear for himself. Fear for them. For Tyler. For the mechanics working 3 decks below. For the cooks in the galley. For every crew member who trusted him to bring them home. The easy choice would have been panic. The human choice was responsibility. He took a slow breath. Then he reached forward and shut off the external warning alarms. The bridge suddenly became quiet. Too quiet. Mason leaned back in his chair. Everybody stay calm. Rachel frowned. Captain. Mason kept watching the approaching pirate ships. His expression never changed. Let them come aboard. For the first time since the contact appeared, Logan smiled. Not because the situation was good. Because he understood exactly what the captain meant. And somewhere deep inside the TSV Resolute, hidden beneath layers of steel and decades of secrets, something had already begun to wake up. The first impact was so gentle that it barely felt real. A faint vibration rolled through the deck beneath their feet as magnetic clamps attached themselves to the hull of the TSV Resolute. Nobody on the bridge said a word. The younger crew members looked toward the ceiling as if they could somehow see what was happening outside. Tyler Brooks gripped the edge of his console. That is it, right? They are attached. Rachel Bennett glanced at her monitor. 3 boarding tubes. Maybe 4. They are taking their time. Why would they take their time? Tyler asked. Logan Reed leaned back in his chair. Because they think they already won. Across the bridge, Mason Walker remained perfectly calm. He checked the ship clock and took another sip of his cold coffee. It tasted terrible. He drank it anyway. The pirate transmission returned. Human vessel. All crew are ordered to remain where they are. Failure to comply will result in penalties. Tyler looked confused. They keep threatening us. That is because they expect people to be scared, Mason replied. Most crews are. A few seconds later, internal sensors confirmed what everyone already knew. Unauthorized personnel had entered the outer airlock. Then another alert appeared. And another. Rachel followed the signals, moving deeper into the ship. They are spreading out fast. Professional? Mason asked. Very. Rachel nodded. Not amateurs. That answer seemed to satisfy him. Mason stood from the command chair and adjusted the sleeves of his jacket. All right. Everybody remembers the plan. Tyler blinked. Wait. There is actually a plan. Several older crew members exchanged amused looks. Logan laughed quietly. Kid, this ship had emergency plans before you were born. Tyler opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was beginning to realize he was the only person in the room who felt surprised. The bridge door slid open. 6 figures stepped through. Tall, armored, confident. Their leader moved straight toward the center of the room without hesitation. Everything about him projected certainty. The certainty of someone who had boarded dozens of ships before and expected this one to be no different. Which one of you is the captain? He asked through a translator device clipped to his chest. Mason raised a hand. That would be me. The pirate leader looked him up and down. You surrendered quickly. You asked nicely. Rachel looked away, hiding a smile. The pirate did not seem amused. You think this is funny? Mason shrugged. Not particularly. The pirate leader stepped closer. I am Craxvorn. From this moment forward, this vessel belongs to me. Mason nodded once. Understood. Tyler could not believe what he was hearing. Nobody argued. Nobody protested. Nobody even looked angry. The entire bridge felt strangely routine, like people handling an annoying customer instead of a hostile boarding party. Crax noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. You are remarkably calm. Long week, Mason answered. For a moment nobody spoke. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then one of the pirates moved toward a navigation terminal. Another checked engineering access. A third scanned the bridge itself. Everything appeared normal. Everything looked exactly like a civilian cargo ship. Yet the longer they stood there, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Not because of fear, because something felt off. The crew was cooperating, but they were not acting defeated. Tyler watched one pirate studying Logan. The alien finally frowned. Why are you smiling? Logan looked genuinely surprised by the question. Am I? The pirate stared at him for several seconds. Then he turned away. A few moments later, another pirate received a message through his headset. He spoke quietly to Crax. The pirate captain listened, then glanced back toward Mason. One of our teams cannot access a maintenance corridor. Mason nodded politely. That happens sometimes. Crax frowned. The door will not respond. Old ship, Mason said. Lots of quirks. Nobody missed the brief look that passed between Mason and Logan. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. For the first time since boarding the Resolute, a tiny seed of doubt appeared in Craxvorn's mind. And somewhere deep below the ship's lowest occupied deck, hidden behind layers of steel no cargo vessel should have possessed, a dormant system quietly completed its startup sequence. Edit: Craxvorn had boarded hundreds of ships during his career. Merchant vessels, mining barges, luxury transports, even military support craft. Every ship told a story within the first 10 minutes. The frightened crews, the desperate negotiations, the rushed attempts to hide valuables. Human ships were supposed to be no different. Yet 20 minutes after taking control of the bridge, he still could not decide what story the Resolute was telling. Report, he ordered. One of his crew members appeared on a nearby display. Engineering access remains restricted. Crax frowned. Restricted by whom? We do not know. The system refuses override commands. Then force entry. We tried. The transmission ended. Crax stared at the screen for a moment before turning toward Mason Walker. The captain sat comfortably in his chair, almost like he was waiting for a delayed flight instead of a hostile boarding operation. Your ship has unusual security. Mason shrugged. You should see the insurance premiums. Nobody laughed except Logan Reed. The engineer quickly looked away when Crax shot him an irritated look. Something about these humans was becoming increasingly annoying. They were cooperating. They were polite. They were answering questions. But none of them behaved like people who had lost control of their ship. Krax left the bridge and headed deeper inside the vessel with 2 members of his crew. The corridors stretched ahead beneath bright white lighting. The walls looked ordinary at first glance, but the longer he studied them, the stranger they appeared. Reinforced supports, multiple sealed bulkheads, emergency power conduits running behind armored panels. For a cargo ship, the construction felt excessive. "Does this bother anyone else?" one pirate finally asked. "A little," another admitted. They reached a maintenance junction where a 4th crew member waited. "Still locked?" Krax asked. The pirate nodded. "The door closed 6 minutes ago. It will not respond to commands." Krax examined the thick steel barrier. It looked more appropriate for a military bunker than a freight vessel. He ran a hand across the surface. Why would a civilian cargo ship need doors like this? Nobody had an answer. Further down the corridor, a faint mechanical sound echoed through the deck. A low hum, then silence. Every head turned. "Did you hear that?" one pirate asked. Krax nodded slowly. "Track the source." They followed the sound for nearly 200 feet before it disappeared completely. Nothing. No machinery. No crew members. No explanation. Just another small detail that refused to fit the picture. Meanwhile, back on the bridge, Tyler Brooks leaned closer to Rachel Bennett. Are they supposed to be wandering around like that? Rachel never looked up from her console. Exactly where they are supposed to be. Tyler blinked. "You sound like this was planned." Rachel finally smiled. "Tyler, there is a reason nobody panicked." Before he could ask another question, every screen on the bridge flickered for half a second. Logan glanced toward a hidden diagnostic display and quietly exhaled. "There it is." Mason looked over. "Status." Logan's smile widened slightly. "Atlas just finished waking up." Mason nodded once. No celebration. No excitement. Just quiet confirmation. Across the ship, hidden systems continued coming online one by one. And for the first time since stepping aboard, Krax Vorn began to feel something he had not expected to find on an unarmed human freighter. He felt unwelcome. Edit. The strange feeling followed Krax Vorn everywhere he went. It lingered in the corners of corridors, behind sealed doors, and inside every conversation with the human crew. Nothing openly threatened him. Nothing challenged his authority. Yet every instinct he had developed over decades of boarding ships kept whispering the same warning. Something was wrong. He stepped into a central transit hub nearly 100 feet long. Cargo lifts lined the walls. Maintenance tracks crossed the ceiling. According to the schematics his team had extracted, this section should have been one of the busiest areas aboard the vessel. Instead, it was almost empty. "Where is everybody?" one pirate asked. Krax looked around. "Good question." The human crew members they encountered seemed unusually comfortable. A mechanic pushing a service cart nodded politely as he passed. A cafeteria worker carried supplies through a side corridor without rushing. Nobody appeared frightened. Nobody appeared desperate. One pirate finally stopped a gray-haired technician. "You do understand that your ship has been captured?" The technician looked genuinely confused. "Captured?" He scratched his chin. "I suppose technically that is true." Then he continued walking. The pirate watched him leave. What does that even mean? Nobody knew. Back on the bridge, Tyler was becoming more nervous by the minute. Why are they letting people move around? Mason glanced toward the young crewman. Because stopping them would make them suspicious. Tyler stared at him. More suspicious? Rachel laughed quietly. "Trust me, we are already past suspicious." Another alarm silently appeared on Logan's private display. He studied it for several seconds before looking toward Mason. Phase 2 is online. Mason nodded. "Any issues?" "None." Tyler raised a hand. "I hate being the only person who does not know what is happening." "You are learning," Mason replied. "That is what matters." Across the ship, Krax entered a control junction where 3 members of his boarding team were waiting. Their expressions immediately caught his attention. "Report." One of them hesitated. "We lost another maintenance camera." Krax frowned. "Destroyed?" "No. It simply disappeared from the network." Another pirate stepped forward. "Captain, we also found something strange inside the infrastructure maps." "What?" The pirate activated a display. A blueprint appeared. Then another. Then another. None of them matched perfectly. Entire sections of the vessel seemed to shift depending on which database they accessed. Additional compartments appeared where none should exist. Reinforced structures were hidden behind ordinary cargo spaces. Krax stared at the images. How old is this ship? Officially? 28 years. And unofficially, the pirate swallowed. We do not know. Silence settled over the room. Somewhere in the distance, a deep mechanical vibration rolled through the hull. Not loud, not dangerous, just enough for everyone to notice. Every pirate turned toward the sound. The vibration lasted only 3 seconds before disappearing. Then the lights flickered once. A single heartbeat later, every monitor in the room went dark. When the displays returned, a new message sat across every screen aboard the ship. No logos, no warnings, just 7 simple words. Authorized human crew confirmed. Standby mode ended. Nobody spoke. For the first time since boarding, Krax felt a chill run down his spine. Because whatever had just awakened did not seem concerned about the pirates at all. It seemed concerned only with the humans. Edit. For several long seconds, nobody aboard the pirate team spoke. The message remained frozen on every screen they could access. Authorized human crew confirmed. Standby mode ended. Krax Vorn stared at the words, waiting for an explanation that never came. Finally, he looked toward one of his technicians. Tell me that is some kind of security greeting. The technician swallowed. I cannot, Captain. Why not? Because I have never seen a civilian ship run systems like this. Back on the bridge, Tyler Brooks was staring at the same message. Okay, I officially need answers. Logan Reed chuckled. Fair enough. Tyler looked from Logan to Mason. What exactly is Atlas? Mason leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the pirates boarded, he seemed willing to explain something. 20 years ago, cargo ships started disappearing along the frontier. Colonies were expanding faster than governments could protect them. Help was often weeks away. So some companies built contingency systems. Tyler frowned. Contingency systems? Rachel answered before Mason could. Imagine a ship designed to keep its crew alive no matter who comes through the airlock. Tyler slowly processed that. You mean security systems? Logan laughed. A lot more than security. Meanwhile, deep inside the vessel, Krax and his team continued exploring. The deeper they went, the less the ship made sense. Cargo vessels were supposed to prioritize storage space, profit, efficiency. This ship seemed built around survival. They passed another sealed bulkhead nearly 18 inches thick. Then another. Then a third. One pirate stopped and stared. Why would a freight company spend money on this? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Eventually, they entered an old maintenance hub hidden behind 2 access corridors. Dust covered the floor. The room looked abandoned. Krax approached a wall terminal and activated it. At first the display remained dark. Then an ancient company logo appeared. Not the current operator. Not the shipping corporation listed in the registry. Something much older. Human Frontier Emergency Program. Below it sat a single line of text. If you are reading this, help is too far away. The room fell silent. What is this place? One pirate whispered. Krax did not answer immediately. He was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. Human ships were not designed according to the same philosophy as most galactic vessels. Other species built ships expecting rescue. Humans built ships expecting isolation. The distinction suddenly felt important. On the bridge, Mason quietly checked another report arriving from Atlas. Crew locations, environmental status, structural integrity. Everything looked normal. Exactly as intended. Tyler watched him. You knew all this would happen? Mason shook his head. Not exactly. Then why are you so calm? Mason glanced toward the stars beyond the viewport. His expression softened slightly. Because panic never solved a problem. Preparation does. For a moment Tyler said nothing. Then he nodded. The answer felt simple. Honest. Human. Across the ship, another notification suddenly appeared on every pirate handheld device. No alarms. No threats. No demands. Just a ship-wide status report. Human crew status, safe. Guest status, monitored. The wording hit harder than any warning could have. Because for the first time since boarding, Krax realized the ship was not treating them like conquerors. It was treating them like visitors who had wandered somewhere they did not belong. Edit. The next hour changed everything. Not because anything dramatic happened. Quite the opposite. The ship remained calm. The engines continued their steady hum. The lights stayed on. The human crew went about their routines. And that was exactly what started getting under the pirate's skin. Krax Vorn stood on the bridge, staring at a tactical display that refused to cooperate. Every route he attempted to access seemed incomplete. Every subsystem offered partial information. It was like trying to understand a city while only seeing random streets. How much control do we actually have? He finally asked. His technician hesitated. Less than we should. Krax did not like that answer. Explain. We can access navigation, but not fully. We can monitor engineering, but not control it. We can see communications, but not modify them. What does that mean? The technician looked uncomfortable. It means the ship keeps deciding what we are allowed to see. The room fell silent. Across the bridge, Mason Walker sat reading a maintenance report on a handheld tablet. He looked more interested in a faulty coolant valve than the pirates standing 10 feet away. Krax walked toward him. You seem remarkably relaxed. Mason glanced up. Should I not be? Your vessel is occupied. Technically. Krax frowned. There was that word again. Technically. The humans kept answering questions without really answering them. It felt less like deception and more like they were waiting for him to reach a conclusion on his own. Back in engineering, Logan Reed reviewed another Atlas update. Several hidden systems were now fully operational. Environmental controls, internal routing, emergency compartment management, all functioning exactly as designed. Rachel Bennett walked in carrying a cup of coffee. How is our guest situation? Logan smiled, growing uncomfortable. That fast. They are starting to notice the ship is not reacting to them. Rachel nodded. Good. She remembered the first time she learned what Atlas actually was. Most species designed ships around efficiency. Humans designed frontier vessels around survival. Somewhere in the history of Earth's expansion, somebody had realized an uncomfortable truth. Help could not always arrive. Sometimes the only thing protecting a crew was the ship itself. Deep inside the vessel, another pirate team reported in. Their voices sounded noticeably less confident than before. Captain, we found additional compartments. Krax activated the channel. How many? We are not sure. What does that mean? Every time we update the internal map, new sections appear. Krax closed his eyes for a moment. The answer made no sense. Yet that was becoming a pattern. Nothing aboard this vessel made sense anymore. A few minutes later, another notification appeared across pirate equipment. No alarm. No threat. Just information. Internal safety routing updated. Human crew priority active. One pirate looked at the message and shook his head. I do not like this ship. Another nodded immediately. Neither do I. Krax heard the exchange and found himself unable to disagree. Because the ship no longer felt like property waiting to be taken. It felt like something aware of its surroundings. Something patient. Something watching. And for the first time since his boarding craft attached to the hull, Krax began wondering whether leaving might have been the smarter decision. Edit. By the time the second hour passed, the mood among the pirates had changed completely. The confidence that had carried them through the airlock was gone. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. They were no longer exploring the ship. The ship was studying them. Krax Vorn stood alone on the bridge, watching stars drift across the main viewport. He hated the feeling. He hated uncertainty. Most of all, he hated the fact that the humans seemed completely unaffected by everything happening around them. Mason Walker sat nearby reviewing another maintenance report. Not tactical data. Not emergency procedures. Maintenance reports. Krax finally broke the silence. I have a question. Mason looked up. Go ahead. Why are your people acting like this? Mason smiled slightly. Acting like what? Like none of this matters. Mason considered the question for a moment. It matters. Then why are you not afraid? The answer came immediately. Because fear does not change outcomes. Krax folded his arms. You speak as if you expected this. Not you specifically. Mason nodded toward the ship around them. But humanity has spent a long time preparing for bad days. That answer lingered in Krax's mind long after the conversation ended. A few decks below, Tyler Brooks sat with Rachel Bennett in a small crew lounge. The young cargo specialist was still trying to understand everything happening around him. Can I ask something? Rachel nodded. Sure. Were humans always like this? Rachel laughed. Prepared. Tyler nodded. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Out on the frontier, you learn quickly that nobody is coming to save you. Storms hit. Systems fail. Accidents happen. Sometimes bad people show up. So what do? Tyler asked. Rachel smiled. You get ready before they arrive. Elsewhere aboard the ship, pirate teams continued trying to gain control of critical systems. Every attempt ended the same way. Access denied. Route unavailable. Command rejected. The messages remained polite. Almost friendly. Somehow that made them worse. One technician finally slammed his hand against a console. This makes no sense. Another pirate looked over. What now? The ship just gave me a safety recommendation. What? It suggested I take a different corridor because traffic conditions were better. The room fell silent. Nobody knew how to respond to that. A few minutes later, every active display aboard the vessel updated again. This time the message was longer. Human crew safety status, nominal. Internal conditions, stable. Recommended action for unauthorized visitors. Return to designated transfer points. Several pirates stared at the notification. One finally spoke. Is the ship asking us to leave? I think it is, another answered. For the first time since boarding, nobody laughed. Back on the bridge, Krax watched another message appear across his personal display. It contained a map leading directly back to the docking tube his crew had used to enter the vessel. No threats. No countdown. No warnings. Just directions. He looked toward Mason. Your ship wants us gone. Mason nodded. That would be the polite interpretation. Krax stared at him for several seconds. Then, for the first time since this operation began, he started wondering whether the stories about human pacifism had been misunderstood from the very beginning. Maybe humans preferred peace. Maybe they avoided conflict whenever possible. But as he looked around the vessel, one uncomfortable realization became impossible to ignore. Nothing aboard this ship had been built by weak people. Edit. 3 hours after the boarding operation began, the balance of power had quietly shifted. Nobody announced it. No alarm sounded. No dramatic confrontation took place. Yet everyone aboard understood it. The human crew was still carrying on with their day. The pirates were the ones checking every corridor twice. Krax Vorn stood in front of the primary communications console. His crew had spent hours trying to establish unrestricted control over the ship. Hours spent chasing permissions, access levels, and system locks that seemed to rearrange themselves whenever they got close. Finally, one of his technicians looked up. Captain, we have a problem. Krax almost laughed. At this point you will need to be more specific. We cannot establish a secure connection with our support vessel. Krax frowned. Communications failure? Not exactly. The technician hesitated. The signal goes out. The signal comes back. The ship keeps rerouting traffic through internal safety systems. Why would a cargo vessel do that? I do not know. Across the bridge, Mason Walker overheard the exchange. He looked mildly amused. Frontier regulations. Krax turned toward him. Frontier regulations interfere with communications? When rescue is weeks away, reliability matters. Mason shrugged. Humans tend to over-prepare. Krax stared at him. Every answer seemed simple on the surface. Yet somehow it always led to another question. Nearby, Tyler Brooks was helping Logan review inventory records. It felt absurd. Pirates occupied the ship, and they were doing paperwork. I still cannot believe this is happening, Tyler admitted. Logan smiled. Believe what? That everyone is acting normal. Logan looked around the bridge. Normal is underrated. Tyler laughed. You know what I mean. Logan nodded. Here's the thing. Most people think courage means not being scared. He pointed toward the crew. Truth is, everybody gets scared. The trick is having a plan before fear shows up. Tyler considered that. It sounded exactly like something his father would have said. Somewhere deep inside the vessel, Atlas continued adapting. Environmental systems adjusted automatically. Access routes updated. Internal monitoring expanded. Every function focused on one priority. Crew safety. The pirates were beginning to notice the pattern. Another notification appeared on their handheld displays. Visitor location verified. Safe route available. One pirate stared at the message. It keeps calling us visitors. Another shook his head. I think that is better than the alternative. Nobody argued. On the bridge, a new transmission suddenly appeared on the main communications panel. It originated from the pirate support ship outside. Several members of Krax's crew visibly relaxed. Finally, outside help. The channel opened. Captain, report your status. Krax stepped forward immediately. Before he could answer, another message appeared beneath the incoming signal. Internal network advisory. External communication available. Assistance request optional. The bridge fell silent. Even Mason looked up from his tablet. Tyler blinked twice. Did the ship just suggest asking for help? Rachel covered her mouth to hide a smile. Krax stared at the message longer than anyone else. Because for the first time since boarding, he realized something deeply unsettling. The ship was not trapping them. It was offering them opportunities to leave. Opportunities they kept refusing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought finally formed that he could no longer ignore. If a human vessel built for survival was still being polite after everything that had happened, then perhaps politeness was not weakness. Perhaps it was restraint. Edit. The decision came quietly. No speeches. No threats. No final standoff. Craxvorn stood on the bridge for a long time staring at the message still glowing on his display. Assistance request optional. Around him, his crew looked exhausted. Not because they had been fighting. Because they had spent hours trying to force control over something that never needed to resist them in the first place. Finally, he opened the communication channel to his support vessel. "This is Captain Craxvorn." The reply came immediately. "Captain, what is your status?" Crax looked around the bridge. At the human crew calmly doing their jobs. At Tyler Brooks carrying inventory reports. At Rachel Bennett drinking coffee. At Logan Reed fixing a maintenance issue. At Mason Walker sitting quietly by the viewport, watching the stars. None of them looked victorious. None of them looked angry. They simply looked like people trying to get through another workday. "Captain," the voice repeated. Crax exhaled slowly. "Prepare docking clearance. We are leaving." Silence followed. "Leaving. That is correct." The channel remained quiet for several seconds before the operator finally answered. "Understood." One by one, the pirates began returning toward their boarding craft. Nobody argued. Nobody protested. The ship even provided route guidance. Every display along the way showed clear directions back to the docking tubes. "Safe exit available. Thank you for your cooperation." One pirate actually laughed when he saw it. "I cannot believe a ship is thanking us." Another shook his head. "I cannot believe I am relieved to leave." Back on the bridge, Tyler watched the last status icons disappear from the internal map. "That is it?" he asked. "That is it," Rachel replied. After all that, Tyler sounded almost disappointed. Mason smiled. Not every victory requires somebody to lose. A few minutes later, the final boarding tube detached. The pirate vessel pulled away into the darkness. The stars returned. The hum of the engines settled back into their familiar rhythm. Everything felt normal again, or at least as normal as life ever became out on the frontier. Before the communication channel closed, one final transmission arrived from Craxvorn himself. "Captain Walker." Mason tapped the console. "Go ahead." There was a pause. "I spent years believing peaceful people were weak." Mason listened without interrupting. "Today I learned something different." Another pause followed. Then Crax continued. "Strength is having power and choosing not to use it." The transmission ended. Nobody spoke for a moment. Tyler looked toward Mason. "Do you think he meant that?" Mason watched the distant stars beyond the glass. "I think he finally understood it." The bridge grew quiet again. Somewhere below, crews returned to work. Cargo schedules resumed. Maintenance requests kept arriving. Life moved forward the way it always did. Years later, Tyler would tell people about that day. Most would expect a story about pirates, hidden systems, and clever technology. But that was never the part he remembered most. What stayed with him was something simpler. Humanity had not survived because it was the strongest species in the galaxy. Humanity had survived because it spent generations preparing for hard times without losing sight of who it wanted to be during the good ones. Out in the darkness between the stars, that lesson mattered more than any weapon ever could. And as the vessel continued its journey home, the old frontier ship carried on doing what it had always been built to do. Protect its people, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to prove how dangerous it could have been.